But during this Advent season, we've been talking about heaven and hell. And this is our final Sunday in Advent. We're going to look at the question, are we in the end times? That's the question for today. And to do this, I want to look at Matthew's chapters 24 and 25. You might remember last week we looked at the end of chapter 25. Jesus talking about the sheep and the goats and some references to hell that we used. This morning we're going to expand our scope and look at this larger conversation that Jesus was having and get a picture of that. We're not going to read the entire 2 chapters, but we'll read enough to get a good feel of the conversation of what's going on. So I want to start at the beginning of Matthew chapter 24 and give us a little context. Matthew 24, beginning at verse 1, Jesus says, Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. And as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So here, just a little context of this conversation that Jesus, starting in verse 4, he's going to actually from 4 all the way to the end of chapter 25, so almost 2 full chapters, he's giving his answer to this question. And so you have to recognize here's Jesus walking away from the temple, and at the very center of Jewish life, he tells his disciples that this temple is going to be destroyed. This kind of rocks their world a little bit. This is the very center of everything that the Jews believe in and are holding true to is the temple. And he says it's not going to be there. And then the disciples privately, later, ask him this question. And really they're asking 2 questions. The first one is this: when will these things happen? In other words, presumably these things he's talking about are the destruction of the temple. When is this going to happen? And secondly, the second question is, what will be the signs of your coming and the end of the age? Now, just to think about that a little bit so we can understand what exactly they're asking. What are the signs of your coming? The coming is Advent. So we celebrate Advent before Christmas. So we're thinking about Christ coming and the preparation of him coming. That's the concept behind the Christian calendar of Advent. It's really the arrival. Well, you think about this, Jesus is already with them. So you're saying, when will you be coming? What is going on here? There's something more to that than what their question is. And you see the second part of that question saying, what will be the sign of the end of the age? The end of the age, or a consummation, meaning bringing to completion. In other words, when will this come about in completion? So think about this. Jesus is already with them. They didn't say, when are you coming back? But in other words, when is this all going to come about? When is this going to be completed and brought to pass? In one way you could see it, them saying, okay, Jesus just said, you are following me as the Messiah, as the promised coming one, and you are expecting a certain kind of Messiah, and maybe I haven't quite lived up to your expectations, but now I'm telling you about this temple is going to be destroyed. And in a sense they're saying, well, when is this going to happen? When are you going to get this party started? And we want to make sure that we don't miss it. So in other words, what's the sign? How do we know when you're going to start? How do we know when we should rise up in arms and follow you and run after that? They weren't thinking about Jesus coming back. They were ready and waiting for him to start acting like the Messiah that they were expecting. They were expecting a ruler Messiah, a mighty king Messiah, and they wanted to follow. And he was starting to talk a little bit about the temple is going to be thrown down. They started to talk in that way, thinking, oh, okay, when is this going to happen? Let us know. So he gives his answer. Now it begins in verse 4, and he begins to address really a series of problems. So let's just read some of his answer here. So verse 4, Jesus answered and said to them, see to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place. But that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation, and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time many will fall away, and will betray one another, and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So I'm going to stop right there. He goes on to say some more, but I brought these kind of problems he was talking about into 4 different categories. So the first one is sort of religious problems. In other words, beware of being misled. There's a lot of false messiahs, false prophets coming. He talks about both messiahs and false prophets. They're going to mislead many. In other words, in your following, your devotion to the Lord, beware of those misleading things. Beware of that. That's going to happen. Another category he talked about is what it's called worldwide problems. In other words, wars, rumors of wars, famines, earthquakes. Those things are still happening. They've been happening since Jesus came. They're continuing to happen. They're things that are affecting the whole world. Another category would be external problems. So persecution coming from the outside inward. So that would be tribulation is the word he used, persecution. He also said, you will be killed on account of me. Martyrdom and dying for the faith. And then internal problems is the last one. So he said, some will fall away. Some will stop believing. There will be a betrayal of one another. Hatred of one another. Increased lawlessness, which could actually be internal or external. But because of the increased lawlessness, he said, many people's love, in fact he says most people's love, will grow cold. These are all things internally going on. People lose hope, lose heart, start to quit, and want to give up. Now, if you think about this through verse 14, up to this point, Jesus could be talking about any place and any time, really throughout history. All of these things, there's been religious problems, there's been misleadings. We'll look at some of those. There's worldwide problems, as I mentioned, those have happened and will continue to happen. External problems, sort of persecution from without, has always been an issue, it continues to be an issue. Internal problems, we see it, people falling away, betrayal, hatred, all of those things are there. But when we keep reading, we see that Jesus is talking a very specific place to a very specific group of people and his disciples. And so if you keep going, now we read through verse 14, go to read verse 15. He says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant, those who are nursing babies in those days. Pray that your flight will not be in winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. He goes on and talks about those days being cut short. But those verses are being very specific. So the abomination of desolation, that's actually quoted back from Daniel. Daniel predicted this thing would happen. And specifically what they're talking about is where the temple is to be destroyed and desecrated. Remember, the very question they asked from the very beginning is, when are these things going to take place? He says the temple is going to get destroyed. And he's starting to give them some answers, some signs of when that is going to happen. And that happened, if you know your history, in AD 70. Very specifically, the temple was destroyed. They came in, brought unholy things into the temple and desecrated it. And so that's a real historical event, a thing that actually happened. He also mentions fleeing Judea, going to the mountainsides, praying that it doesn't happen on the Sabbath or in the winter. These aren't necessarily life principles that we can apply to our lives today. We can't just say, oh, okay, well, when Jesus comes back, I'm going to make sure I flee Judea. Well, we're not in Judea, so how does that help us? And woe if those are pregnant. Well, we shouldn't get pregnant because Jesus might come back. So these are things Jesus was talking about, a very specific time and place, not meant for us to apply to those things. Well, what do we do with this passage? We say, well, it just doesn't matter anymore. There are, I think, some applicable things, some principles we can pull out of it, because these are problems that still exist today. So I think we can find some principles behind it, but those don't answer the question that we're trying to answer. It's a very interesting thing to see about the context is really important when you're trying to figure out something. When I started here studying this passage, I thought, I'm going to get all sorts of great things out of here, principles, which we will get to, but realizing that the understanding the context is very important to know who is Jesus talking to, and then how do we bring that forward. So, I want to go back to the question, are we in the end times? And then add to that, because I think Jesus' disciples were also asking this question, how can we know? So are we in the end times, and how can we know? Now he starts by talking about some perilous times and a specific moment that they had to be aware of, but he's also talking about some things in general. He goes on, we read through about verse 22, he goes on, but I wanted to jump ahead, because Jesus gives a very specific and clear answer to this question, and it starts in verse 36. So he's still giving the answer. I'm just skipping a little bit. But in verse 36 he says this, "Of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left." So, are we in the end times? How can we know Jesus' answer? Nobody knows. Now, I know that's not a real fulfilling answer. That's not the thing we want to know. But this is the reality of, I'm just telling you, this is what Jesus said. Nobody knows. He said, I don't even know. He said, just the Father. The Father alone knows. The angels in heaven don't know. Only He knows. Now, here's the other thing. We don't know when He will come, but when He comes, we will know. We won't be surprised. Some verses that back this up. Verse 27, "As lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man." In other words, you can't miss it. Like you didn't say, oh, I didn't see that lightning. You know, it lights up the whole sky. Verse 30, he says, "The sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn." Again, it's going to appear in the sky. "They will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of the sky with power and great glory." And then down in verse 39 that we read, they did not understand. He's talking about Noah in those days. So they're giving in marriage. They're just going about living their lives. Noah's building this big box. People are trying to figure out, what's this crazy guy doing? It hadn't rained up until that point. They just got moisture on the land. It had not rained, and they're like, what's going on with this guy? And they did not understand, or they did not know, until the flood came and took them all away. So, in other words, they're just living their lives. Things are always going to be as they always have been. And all of a sudden, you know, the ground bursts forth, water's pouring out of everywhere, and then they're like, oh, that's what He meant. That's what it's going to be like when Jesus comes back. We don't know when it's going to be, but when He comes, we'll know. We're going to know. So now, if we're not supposed to know, people say, well, what about the book of Revelation? Like, God gave us this whole book of Revelation and talks about the end times. So again, I want to think about the concept of context. John, the Apostle John, the one whom Jesus loved, is the writer of the book of Revelation. Jesus came down, gave him this special revelation. It was towards the end of his life. And you think about what happened when this was going on. First generation of Christ followers. John is one of the last of the original apostles. They were all getting persecuted and killed for their faith. He was exiled to an island, and so he was there. All of the followers of Christ were passing away. John was really holding out, and throughout their entire lifetime, they had this belief, this expectation that Jesus was coming back soon. You see it in Paul's writings. He said, He's coming. Like, just get ready. Just hold on for a little bit. In fact, you read in the book of Acts, they sold all their possessions and just lived together. Just hang out and wait for Jesus to come. They had this belief. If they just would hold on for a little bit longer, everything would be okay. But now, John's on an island, all the original generation is dying. The conditions are changing, and the perspective is changing. In fact, you see in Paul's letters, Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, if you don't work, you don't eat. In other words, yeah, Jesus is coming back, but don't quit your job. Like, keep working until He comes. Their perspective was changing. The first generation was passing away. In light of these changes, what hope did they have for the future? Why was Jesus taking so long? 2,000 years now, later, we can ask the same question. Jesus, why are you taking so long? And before John dies, Jesus gives him this special revelation. As Revelation itself describes it, verse 1:1, things which must soon take place. Things must soon take place. And in fact, at the end of Revelation 22:6, it says the same thing. These are signs of things which must soon take place. It's coming soon. Don't despair. Don't lose hope. The perspective has changed. You thought it was going to happen right now, but right now is not what you think right now is. I think I read this last week, that passage in 2 Peter. God's concept of time is not the same as our concept of time. And so his soon is not the same concept of our soon. So, to answer the question about Revelation, I don't believe that Revelation is given to us as sort of a code that we have to figure out to know when Jesus will come back. Now, I know cracking codes is fun, and there's a lot of fun stuff in Revelation, and I think it's worthwhile to study a lot of things that we can get out of Revelation. God gave it to us for a reason. I'm not saying that. But if you just step back away from the details of the seals and the trumpets and the bowls and all the stuff that's going on in there, I really see Revelation as a message of encouragement to a discouraged generation. Again, think of the context of what's going on, as well as not only an encouraging revelation Jesus giving to them at a very pivotal moment in history, but also giving a picture of Jesus as the supreme king when that was just starting to be in doubt. When waiting literally seemed to be taking forever. And all of a sudden, Revelation came at just the right moment. I firmly believe that every generation, ours included, is called to live like Jesus is coming in this generation. We're called to live that way, with that expectation. At the same time, preparing and equipping future generations should he delay. We need that long-term, multi-generational vision, along with a short-term, immediate urgency. Like, prepare for forever, but live for right now. And I think we need to have that combination. Now, if you don't like the answer of, well, we just don't know, you're not alone. This has been true throughout history. This has not really been received well. We just want to know. We want definite answers. And it started, actually, with Judas. So this talk that Jesus is giving goes through the end of chapter 25. And then 26, Jesus says, I'm going to be handed over to be crucified, 26 verse 2. And so the Pharisees start plotting together how to do this, the chief priests and elders. They're trying to find a way. And then you get down to verse 14. So really just a day or so after, one of the 12, Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What are you willing to give me to betray him to you?" This is very shortly after Jesus gave his answer. An answer that Judas was like, man, that's not what I was hoping for. Like I've heard different theories about Judas. Either they thought if they betrayed him, he kind of would like spark this fire in him and he would become the Messiah king that he was waiting for. Or he just kind of was disillusioned. Like, this is not the Messiah I was looking for and wanted. Either one of those, the point is that Judas was not real happy with Jesus' answer. The sense of, you just don't know. And all of a sudden, this is not the Messiah I was looking for. And so we see that there. But, Judas is an easy guy to pick on. It wasn't just him. It was really all the disciples. So if you go to the book of Acts, now Jesus had died, rose from the grave. He's conquered death. Okay, now he is king victorious. He has conquered the last thing to be conquered, death. And so he tells him to go meet at a certain mountain. He's going to meet him there. Acts chapter 1, we see this. They meet him there, and they're thinking, all right, now good stuff's going to happen. And so they ask him, this is their question, Lord, is it at this time you're going to restore the kingdom of Israel? The kingdom to Israel? In other words, now it's time. Now it's time to do something, right? Like, you came back from the dead, now we get it, now you're going to do it. And what did Jesus tell him? The same thing he said in Matthew 24, Acts 1:7. It is not for you to know the times of the epochs which the Father has fixed by his own authority. And then he ascended into heaven. That was like, well, he gave him power on high from the Holy Spirit. That's an important verse, Acts 1:8. But that was like he said, it's not for you to know, but I'm not leaving you alone. I'm giving you my power through the Holy Spirit while you're waiting. And so throughout history, you'll see this same theme. People trying to figure out God's plan. Now, so I just want to give you a small sampling of this And just so you're aware, like, this is coming from Wikipedia, so take it for what it's worth, But I'm like, well, what are the predictions for the end of the time, end of the world? And let's get a few of these. So these are all the predicted dates of when the world is supposed to end. I'll just highlight some of them. The one prediction was 500 based on the dimensions of Noah's Ark. That was one of their theories. You might see some names you'd recognize in there. Mathematicians got thrown in the mix. This guy calculated Judgment Day would begin at 8 a.m. on October 19th, 1533. Just a little bit off, but we should celebrate every October 19th, probably. You'll see some other names. This is an interesting one. December 25th, Christmas Day, 1814. 64-year-old self-described prophet claims she was pregnant with a Christ child. In other words, Christ is coming back the second time like he did the first. And he would be born on Christmas Day. Interestingly, she died on Christmas Day, the day of her prediction. So they did an autopsy, and she wasn't pregnant. So it didn't happen. Sometimes you see a lot of, kind of you think, oh, these are just wackos or out there people. But John Wesley's on the list. He thought the world was going to end in 1836. He's fairly mainline. You see certainly that you got Jehovah's Witnesses in there. The Mormons make an appearance. This interesting group called the Catholic Apostolic Church had 12 disciples. It's like they started the book of Acts all over again in 1831, and they claimed by the time the last founder died, Christ would come back. And that was in 1901. That didn't happen. You see the Jehovah's Witnesses show up again. Sun Myung Moon, name you might recognize. And then even beyond, I might have passed this one. I like this one, Herbert Armstrong. When you just like keep guessing, well, that wasn't right. Well, let me try another one. How many chances do you get? Harold Camping will show up on there again too. He just kept saying, well, I meant this. This is what I really meant. And I mean, even recently, we've seen even into the future, you'll see these names where people are trying to figure out the exact dates. But I just don't think that's what Jesus wanted us to know. The question then, if no one knows, if that's the answer, is that it? Okay, no one knows. That's the end of the question. Well, if you keep following Jesus' conversation in 24 and 25, we'll see that he had actually, I think, 3 more points to make. And he gives them in chapter 24, verses 42 through 51, and then he expands on those with 3 stories or parables. And this really came out to me at our last week's Bible study. We were studying Matthew 25, and I was like, wow, and they just really tied together. So I want to share those with you. So let's if you're still there, Matthew chapter 24, let's just read 42 through 51. I'll highlight those. I won't read the parables. Hopefully you're somewhat familiar with them. If not, you can read them as I'm talking. But so Matthew 24, 42, he says, okay, no one knows. That's the summary, verse 36. And then 42 begins with a therefore. Okay, so we see, therefore, be on the alert. For you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason you also must be ready. For the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. Who then is a faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, my master is not coming for a long time, and begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, at an hour which he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So we see 3 things, I think, from Jesus' answer. And the first one is this, be on the alert. Jesus tells them to be on the alert. Be ready. You see it time and again in the first few verses. In other words, he's not coming when you think he is. What's the point of trying to calculate out the exact day? Is that because I can live however I want until that exact day? Be ready. He can come at any moment. And then he expands on that in that parable in beginning of Matthew 25, the parable of the 10 virgins. If you're familiar with that, there's 5 foolish virgins and 5 prudent virgins, or wise virgins. And the 5 foolish virgins, they said, were not prudent. Prudent means they were not sensible or practically wise. It's also, interestingly, the same word that's used in 24:45 when Jesus describes a faithful and sensible slave whose master put in charge of everything. Faithful and sensible or prudent. So there's 5 virgins that were not prudent, 5 that were. The prudent ones, what did they do? They took extra oil. Why? Because he might be delayed. There might be a snowstorm. He might have run into someone along the way. They are going to be ready. They're not just saying, well, he said you'd come at 10, so I only need enough oil for that amount of time. They were prudent. They said, well, things might happen. Delays might take place. They brought extra oil. That'd be the equivalent for us of not driving your car till your gas tank is like on E, and then looking for a gas station. That would not be prudent. They brought extra oil, so it'd be like going on a hike and taking some extra food in case you get lost. Not that I'm speaking from experience, but just an example I've heard from others. It might be, when you're budgeting, of having an emergency fund set aside because something that you're not planning for might actually happen. That's called practical wisdom, prudence. This is what Jesus is referring to on being on the alert. The prudent virgins. And here's the thing: you look at this parable, and the foolish ones go to the wise ones and they say, "Hey, he's coming. Let us have some more oil. We ran out. We don't have enough." And the prudent say, "No, we can't. If we give you, then we'll run out. Then no one will be there. It just doesn't work." And so what we see from this is that when Jesus comes, we can't rely on someone else's preparedness. It doesn't work that way. You think some people prepare for emergency preparedness in a different way. Cold weather or the end of the world or whatever. Some people stock up with food and water, right? Other people stock up with guns so they can get the people who stocked up on food and water. That's one way to do it, but it doesn't work that way when Jesus comes back. You can't rely on someone else's preparedness. We have just this life to be prepared. And the parable, it says they went into the feast with the 5 who were prepared, and it says, and the door was shut. And that's it. The door is shut. And so we have this life to get prepared, and that's it. When it's over, the door is shut. So we can't wait to be on the alert. We have to do it now. We can't rely on others to be on the alert for us. We have to be on the alert. Because on that final day, we don't want Jesus to say how he ended that parable. He answered, "Truly I say to you, I do not know you." And so a question that we can ask ourselves is, does Jesus know us? And do we know him? Does Jesus know us? Are we alert? Are we ready? The second point about the end times is to be a faithful steward. And again, Jesus references this really 45 to the end. He's talking about stewardship. God puts us in charge of his household until he returns. We don't know when that's going to be. But are we being faithful, sensible, prudent about that? If you look at verse 48, we see what happens. And we see this around ourselves. Hopefully we don't see it in our own lives. But sometimes we just kind of give up or say, well, Jesus isn't coming for a long time. So we get lazy and we start forgetting that we have to give an account of all that he's left us with someday. We realize that everything we do and say and our whole life, it has to be an accounting before the Lord. We kind of forget that. We just put it up our mind because it's been so long and we don't remember. Part of the whole concept of the Christian calendar, like celebrating Advent or taking communion or remembering the Easter Sunday every year, is because we're remembering. We're remembering what Christ has done. So we don't forget. We don't become lazy. We don't think, oh, it's been so long since he's come. Why do we still do that? What's the point? Why do we do that anymore? Well, we're remembering ourselves. We're trying to be faithful stewards. And this point is expanded in the next parable, the parable of the talents. That's the parable Jesus gave the guy went away. He gave one person 1 talent, which is a sum of money, 2 talents, and 5 talents. And they all went off and did different things with them. The couple of things I want you to notice about that parable is it's not about what you're given, but rather it's about what you do with what you're given. So, for example, the ones with 2 and 5, they both doubled their investments, and that was good. But one produced 5, the other produced 2. They didn't produce the equal amount. But if you look at how they were rewarded, it was rewarded equally. Verse 21, I'm in chapter 25 now. Verse 21 and 23 are the same. To the one with 2 and the one with 5. He said, "Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." Identical phrases. they're rewarded the same because they were faithful with what they were given. It's not about what they were given, but what they did with it. Now, when you contrast that with the third slave, who was actually the first slave, the one who was given 1 talent, he produced nothing, not even interest. And in verse 27, the manager said, well, at least you could have produced some interest. I mean, anything on my return, so that I had something to show for it. And the point here about this one that I want us to take away from it is that our understanding of God greatly affects our actions while waiting for his return. You look at the first 2 slaves. They proceeded with confidence, knowing that the master would be happy for them because they were being productive with his money. If you think about this, earning money or investing well does not go without risk. They had to take some risk. They could have lost the money, but they had confidence in their master, in who he was, the kind of person he was, and they thought, he'd rather have us try and do some risks and make some investments, even if it turned out bad, at least we tried, than if we didn't do anything. That's their view of their master. Well, so because they trusted their master, they proceeded with confidence. Contrast that with the third slave. What was his view of his master? Well, he tells us in verse 24, in chapter 25, he says, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. And because of that, he had fear, verse 25. I was afraid, so he operated out of his understanding of that master. And he operated very differently. So a wrong understanding of our master will cause us to behave wrongly while waiting for his return. So the question for us in this case is, do we have a correct understanding of who Jesus is? Do we just understand him as the way we want him to be, or maybe the way we thought he was in Sunday school from our childhood, or are we continuing to learn and understand who Jesus really is by what he says and does according to the Scriptures, not by what we want him to be like? So being a faithful steward brings us another question. The third and final point then is to serve those with the least. And we talked about that a little bit last week, but serving your fellow man, especially those with the least. Now in chapter 24, we see it in a couple of verses. We see that part of that stewardship includes how we treat those under our care. So God's given us people to care for. It might be family members, it might be co-workers, it might be neighbors, it might be people in our community. We have a stewardship to treat those people well and under our care. And so we see from chapter 24, verse 45, that would include feeding people. In verse 49, it would include being kind. In other words, not mistreating or beating. And also, the sentence he talked about getting drunk and hanging with drunkards. So not misusing alcohol or any other substance that causes us to treat other people in a harmful or abusive way. These are things that we have a stewardship and accountability to answer to God with. Now this is expanded into the story of the sheep and the goats. Again, at the last days, Jesus will separate like the sheep and the goats, those who did his will and those who did not. And what we see from that if we look at that list of caring for those in our midst, caring for the least of these, it includes things like quenching thirst for others, inviting in and being hospitable to strangers, clothing the naked, visiting the sick and prisoners. These are some things that God calls us to do in serving the least. So as we're waiting for Jesus, we take care of those around us, especially those who cannot repay. Jesus said in Luke 14, verses 12 through 14, he said, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors. Otherwise, they may also invite you in return, and that will be your repayment. But when you give a reception, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, since they do not have the means to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So when we look at serving those with the least, the question we have is, can we recognize Jesus in other people? At the end of that story in 25, they said, the goats who didn't do anything, they said, when did we see you sick and in prison? We would have visited you. And he said, as much as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. They did not see Jesus in the least of these. Are we able to recognize Jesus in other people? So, are we living in the end times? The reality is only God knows. But while we're waiting, we have some challenges. To be on the alert, to be a faithful steward, and to care for people around us. And that all boils down to our relationship with Jesus. So some of those questions we can ask. We need to make sure that Jesus knows us and that we know him. To make sure that we have a correct understanding of who he is and that we can recognize him in others. As I said it before, every generation is called to live like Jesus is coming in this generation, with that sense of urgency. At the same time, we need to be preparing and equipping coming generations should he delay. We need that combination of a long-term, multi-generational vision with a short-term, immediate urgency.